The reason for producing this film is that soon the city of Jerusalem will become the focus of world opinion. Jerusalem will become a stumbling block to world peace, eventually a bargaining tool to resolve political issues of such magnitude that it will lead to a catastrophic battle involving the major armies of the world in a nuclear holocaust. Four separate groups currently have an interest in Jerusalem. Firstly, the Jewish people, because of their historical claim. Their belief that as a legally constituted nation, it is their designated capital, because only in Jerusalem can they rebuild the temple, without which their religious worship and vision of God cannot be fulfilled, and finally, that every prophecy relating to their future indicates that their Messiah must return to the rebuilt temple in this place. Secondly, Bible-believing Christians accept the Jewish and biblical prophecies concerning Jerusalem which will be fulfilled. They make no claim to the city, except to believe that the Bible says that the Jews will return, rebuild the temple, and that the Jewish Messiah will return to the city when he returns to the earth at his second coming. Therefore, Jerusalem will be, at that time, under Jewish-Israeli control. Thirdly, the Moslems, who believe that it was on the Temple Mount that their father Abraham sacrificed his son Ishmael, that the Prophet Muhammad ascended into heaven from the Temple Mount in the night journey on his winged horse, and that the Dome of the Rock is the third most holy place for the Muslim faith. Fourthly, the Palestinian people, who claim that as the more recent dwellers in the land, Jerusalem is their political capital. Let's look at the brief history of Jerusalem. One of the earliest recorded mentions of the area is in 2050 before Christ, when Abraham was told by God to sacrifice his son on Mount Moriah, today the temple area, and the Dome of the Rock are on this same Mount Moriah. Another record was in 1250 before Christ, when Joshua defeated the king of Jerusalem. Then again in 1005 before Christ, when David was appointed king of Israel after the death of King Saul. The first thing that he did was to march his army to Jerusalem, then occupied by the Jebusites, a Canaanite tribe, where he conquered the fortress of Zion. That's referred to in the first book of Chronicles, chapter 11, verse 4. From this fortress of Zion, David built the walled city, which became called the City of David, and still is today. Shortly after this, because of his sin and the plague which God sent on Israel, God commanded David to buy the land on the top of Mount Moriah, where Abraham had sacrificed his son, for 600 gold shekels, and to make a sacrifice and build the temple there. The Roman invasion in the year 70 before Christ ended Jewish independence in the land. Jerusalem itself was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. Jewish independence in Israel was re-established in 1948. Despite this long break, the longest period of sovereignty over Jerusalem by any nation belongs to the Jews. Throughout all periods of foreign rule over Jerusalem, beginning with the Romans in 70 before Christ, through Byzantine, Persian, Arab, Crusader, Mamluk, and the Ottoman Turks, ending in 1918, Jews were persecuted, massacred, and subject to exile. In spite of this, the Jewish presence in Jerusalem remained constant and enduring.
Historical facts are that throughout history there have always been Jews in this land, in the Holy Land. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but there has never been a period when there were no Jews in the country. The most interesting fact, I think, is that in Jerusalem itself, since before the mid-19th century, there was a majority of Jews. It was mostly religious Jews. There were many people who came here to study and also to die and to be buried on Mount Olives.
Beside the Jewish people, no other nation or state that gained political sovereignty over the area ever made Jerusalem a capital city. The Arab and Mamluk empires chose to rule from Damascus, while the Ottoman ruler resided in Constantinople. None of these empires even granted Jerusalem the status of district capital.
What happened since the rise of Islam in 622 after Christ is that most of the time it was under Islamic rule, whatever ruler it was, Umayyad dynasty, Mamluk or Ottoman rule. Almost 200 to 250 years it was not ruled by Islamic rule, be it Christian crusades, British mandate, and just now recently in the last 57 years or 37 years, of course, the Jewish sovereignty, Israel. Now, it is clear to us that whenever Islamic rule was here, Jerusalem was secondary to Arab interests. They dominated it, but they never invested in it. It was never a political central town in any Arab rule. It became almost dear to the Muslims only when it was ruled by Christians or by Jews. And this is a puzzle, a historical puzzle, why Jerusalem is neglected when it is under Islamic rule and why it is so dear to them when it is under another rule.
Let's look at the divisions of the Middle East from 1917 to 1948. 100 years ago, there were no great world powers in the Middle East. Oil had not been discovered in Arabia or Iraq. Jerusalem was a small, slumbering, insignificant town, and the land was considered infertile and worthless. The Middle East is often thought of as the cradle of ancient civilizations, yet few of the region's modern states have existed more than 70 years. The land was simply carved up into artificial entities by Britain and France after the 1914-18 war. The whole Middle East was ruled by the Ottoman Turkish Empire from the 16th century until, in 1917, when, during the First World War, because they fought with Germany against Britain, the Turks were driven out and defeated by the Western Allies. After the war, the British assumed responsibility for the largest part under a League of Nations mandate. Iraq. Britain appointed Abdullah Faisal, the Prince of Mecca, as King of Iraq in 1921, and in 1932, Iraq became an independent nation. Syria. After the Ottoman Empire disintegrated, Syria became a French mandate. Following the fall of France in the Second World War, Syria was occupied by the Allies, who encouraged it to become independent in 1941. Jordan. Transjordan formed under the British Mandate as the land on the east bank of the River Jordan achieved full independence from Britain in 1946 as the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, with King Abdullah Hussein as king. 2 years later, the British Mandate in Palestine also came to an end, and 5 Arab nations fought Israel for control of the region. A ceasefire was called in 1949, by which time Jordanian forces had occupied what was to become known as the West Bank, as well as Gaza and the Old City of Jerusalem. This territory was annexed to Jordan, but they lost possession of it in the 1967 Six-Day War against Israel. The PLO. Arafat formed the PLO in 1964 to unite Palestinian Arab groups opposed to Jewish existence in the land. After the Arab defeat in the Six-Day War in 1967, control of the PLO devolved to the leadership of various militia groups, the most dominant being Yasser Arafat's al-Fatah. Fatah means conquest by jihad. In 1969, Arafat became chairman of the PLO, which was recognized by the Arab nations and the United Nations as the representative of all Palestinians. The PLO was based in Jordan, but its aim of establishing a Palestinian state conflicted with Jordan's desire to regain the land it had lost in the Six-Day War. Civil war broke out between the Palestinian guerrillas and the Jordanian army. In 1974, the Jordanian government recognized the PLO and its claim to Gaza, West Bank and Old Jerusalem, but expelled Arafat from Jordan. He went to Lebanon, where, with Lebanese Muslims, he declared jihad on Lebanese Christians, and the bloody civil war lasted 20 years, until 1995. Looking at Israel and the Jews. If you look at the Jewish or Israeli claims to Jerusalem, we must identify a clear difference between Israel as a nation and the Jews as an ethnic, cultural, or national identity. The Jews are clearly identified as a separate ethnic or national race. For 4,000 years, they have been identified through Abraham and his son Isaac. Then, when Isaac's son Jacob was chosen instead of his older twin brother Esau, and God renamed Jacob as Israel, the father of the nation. So Abraham was the one to whom the land was given. His grandson Jacob was the one whose name was changed by God and became the first mention of the name Israel. Jews are clearly identified throughout history, from their first beginning with Abraham in the land of Canaan, through their emigration into Egypt under Jacob, their return to the promised land of Canaan under Moses, their captivity in Babylon, and their final return under Zerubbabel, until their final dispersal after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. From the time Abraham left that part of the land of Canaan between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, promised to him and his descendants by God, to go into Egypt to escape the famine, until now, the struggle has been for Abraham's descendants, Israel, to repossess this land. This period of the diaspora still identifies the Jewish people, their language and culture, and finally their persecution. In fact, it is the persecution ending in the Holocaust which more than anything confirms their identity. We need to ask the question, who are the Palestinians? The name Palestine is derived from the Roman Empire's name for the land of Israel after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, as an insult and a memorial to Israel's ancient enemy. The Philistines of the Bible were probably Greek-speaking sea people from the Aegean who invaded the land of Canaan around 1,000 years before Christ. A Greek historian called the land of Israel the Philistine Syria. This was eventually shortened to Palestine. In the days of King David and the Jewish nation in Israel, these Philistines only occupied a coastal area extending approximately north from Gaza to Jaffa. They did not occupy or make any claim to Jerusalem. 20th century Palestinian identity was at first ascribed to all those individuals, both Jew and Arab, who lived in the land under the British Mandate before the State of Israel was declared in 1948. This identity was created by the British, but centuries before this, it was the Christian Church that perpetrated the Roman insult and gave the name of Palestine to the land of Israel, although in the region it was never known by this name.
Insofar as that the mandate for Palestine covered a certain territory, which was both sides of the River Jordan, and then there was the national home for the Jewish people was applied to the western side of this Palestine. And therefore it was run under a very specific administration. And the fact that it was run under this very specific administration within a certain territory actually created the Palestinian people. That means the Arabs that lived in western Palestine started calling themselves Palestinians. Because before that there was not a Palestine, and there was a greater Syria. There were all sorts of other names that were used. In fact, the word Palestine in the 19th century was used primarily by British and by other European peoples, not by the Turks themselves. That was not the name of this particular country. So that in fact you could really say that the specific people who identify themselves today as the Palestinians or the Arab Palestinians were in fact created as such when the British mandate for Palestine started to function in the beginning of the last century.
Then looking at Christians. Present-day Bible-believing evangelical Christians have no claim over the city. Unlike the earlier Crusaders, who made it their capital and appointed the Habsburgs as kings of Jerusalem, the majority of these Christians support the Jewish claim to rightful ownership of the city. They believe that Jews should return to Israel, that the temple will be rebuilt, and that the Jewish Messiah will come to Jerusalem and to the new temple, in fulfillment of both Bible and Jewish prophecy. They also have an interest because they believe that one day Jew and Gentile will be joined in recognizing the coming of the Messiah, who will break the barriers between the two peoples, Jew and Gentile. Looking at the Muslim claim to Jerusalem, in the 7th century after Christ, Islam exploded upon the world scene. As a boy, Muhammad learned about the scriptures from Jewish and Christian merchants. Later, as an adult, he reinvented what he had heard, calling it a revelation supposedly given personally to him by an angel. Hence, the Quran reflects in a distorted manner the Judeo-Christian Bible, but with a grave difference. Muhammad created his new religion as a tool to seize political power for himself. Seeking to enforce these revelations and to control his own people in Mecca, he failed, and initially fled to Medina. Here he regrouped his followers and 2 years later, in 630 after Christ, took Mecca by force. Thus, Mecca became the center of Muhammad's new religion, together with Medina. Muhammad never actually went to Jerusalem. It was one of his successors, the Caliph Omar, who conquered the city in 638 after Christ, after Muhammad's death. To one side of the city of Jerusalem is the most dominant feature, known to the Jews as the Temple Mount, where historically the first temple was built by Solomon. The Muslims call this place Al-Haram al-Sharif. Here stand today two Muslim shrines, the Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock. The first is the Great Mosque of Jerusalem, built by Sultan Suleiman in approximately 1538 after Christ. The Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, the further mosque, which derives its name from Muhammad's tale of a mystical night journey mounted on the winged steed called Al-Burak, with, he says, the angel Gabriel for escort. He was carried from Mecca to Sinai, then to Bethlehem, after which, he says, they came to Jerusalem. From the sacred rock on the Temple Mount, Muhammad says he ascended by a ladder of light up to heaven, accompanied by Gabriel. The second feature of the Temple Mount today is the Dome of the Rock. Built in 691 after Christ, during the division of Islam into rival factions, as a political, economic, and religious counter-attraction to Medina and Mecca, and at the same time a symbol to deny Christianity, Judaism, and the scriptures. Written inside, as the strongest provocation to the Christian faith, are inscriptions 730 feet long, stating, "The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was only a messenger of Allah. Allah is only one God. Far be it removed from his transcendent majesty that he should have a son." And that's in Quran 4:171. So if Muhammad is a prophet and he denies that Jesus is the Son of God, he is a false prophet. For the last 1300 years, the Temple Mount has remained in the hands of Muslims, with only one exception. In 1099, Jerusalem was taken from the Muslims by the Crusaders from Europe. They slaughtered the inhabitants of Jerusalem, Jew and Muslim alike, and converted the Dome of the Rock into a Christian church called the Templum Domini, the Temple of Our Lord. The Crusaders also used the Al-Aqsa Mosque as headquarters for the Knights Templar, who officiated on the temple compound. This occupation was relatively short-lived. The feared Muslim leader, Saladin, proclaimed a jihad or holy war to retake the land. After 90 years of Crusader control, Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin's army in 1187. The Muslim position on the Temple Mount has been made clear. The main reason that the Temple Mount is holy in Judaism is that it was the site of the temple. This same fact provides a major reason for its holiness in Islam. It is still considered to be the orthodox Islamic position. A booklet published in 1930 by the Supreme Muslim Council, called A Brief Guide to Al-Haram al-Sharif, states, "The site is one of the oldest in the world. Its sanctity dates from the earliest times. Its identity with the site of Solomon's temple is beyond dispute. This too is the spot, according to universal belief, on which David built an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings." Since the beginning of Islam, this has been the orthodox position. However, starting in the 1990s, some people, including Sheikh Ikrimah Sabri, chairman of the Palestinian Higher Islamic Commission and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, have denied that the site is connected with Solomon, David, or had any Jewish history. Muslims have no greater claim than the Jews. Actually, it was the Romans, not the Muslims, who evicted the Jews from the city. In fact, under Muslim rule, particularly Sultan Suleiman in 1538 after Christ, who reputedly built the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Jews were encouraged to live in the city and given access to the western wall of the temple area. At the end of the 18th century, European powers' interest grew in the Middle East, especially in Israel, and the weak Turkish government allowed the building of consulates, hospitals, hotels, and churches. It was not until 1967 that the Jews finally regained sovereignty of the Temple Mount and the western wall of the old Jewish temple during the Six-Day War. This was the first time in 1,900 years, and Israel still in 2006 retains the sovereignty. However, 10 days after the taking of the Temple Mount, Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan ordered the site to be returned to the administrative control of the Muslims. 5,000 attended the renewal of Friday prayers there. Since this time, the Muslim religious authority has carried out regular construction on the Temple Mount. Until recently, only renovation work was conducted, generally in consultation with the Israeli Antiquities Authority. Projects included renovations of the Dome of Al-Aqsa, the gilding of the Dome of the Rock, only improvements to the existing structures. More significant is the clearing of Solomon's stables. The Crusaders assumed that King Solomon kept his horses in an underground vault at the southeast corner of the temple complex. Construction work was agreed by the government of Shimon Peres in 1996. The work essentially involved renovating floors, installing lighting, putting in carpets and plastering. None of these projects has upset the Israeli archaeological community as much as their recent development. The Waqf approached the Israeli government to open up all 7 underground vault archways of Solomon's stables, requiring to dig an area 15 meters deep on the Temple Mount. Permission was granted for 2 archways only to be opened. The Muslims did not excavate carefully but used destructive bulldozers, loaded the earth on trucks and dumped the resulting rubble in the Kidron Valley. The archaeologists view this gravely. There has never ever been an excavation on the Temple Mount. Therefore, it was paramount that it should be done in a way that would adhere to normal archaeological procedure, which is very strict in Israel. The earth dumped in the Kidron Valley contains all the broken and destroyed evidence of the historical occupations of the Mount. The Muslims had a reason. They maintained that the Jews never had a temple on this place, that it belongs solely to Islam, that the Jews have no claim here. Looking at the Jewish temples, Israel's first temple, built in 950 before Christ, was built by King Solomon. Israel's first temple was designed to be similar to the desert tabernacle of Moses in its basic layout, but on a larger, more magnificent scale. Solomon's temple lasted for 410 years until King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon destroyed it. Aware of the impending threatened destruction, King Josiah commanded that the Ark of the Covenant, the menorah, and other vessels be hidden away in a place which only the temple priests would know. Then we come to the Second Temple. Following the release of the Jews from Babylon, Zerubbabel began work on a second temple, completed in 520 BC. Then we come to Herod's temple, 19 years before Christ. When the Romans imposed King Herod as ruler over the Jews, he made a plan to win their loyalty. Complaining that the temple of Zerubbabel was built like a fortress and shorter than Solomon's by about 90 feet, he began a reconstruction 19 years before Christ, which was to be equal to an entire rebuilding. Herod himself said that his work was only intended as an enlarging and further beautifying of Zerubbabel's temple. This is why Herod's temple has never been counted as the third temple. That is still to come. The main part of the rebuilding was completed before Herod's death in 4 BC, but the work went on for more than 60 years after that. The temple was not entirely finished until 63 years after the birth of Christ, just 7 years before its destruction by the Romans in the year 70. There is to be a third temple. According to the sages of Israel, it is a commandment of God for the people of Israel to rebuild the temple. To fulfill the blueprint as described by the prophecy of Ezekiel, the structure of this third temple will necessitate vast topographical changes in the environs of Jerusalem. The new temple will be so large that it will occupy the entire area of the city of Jerusalem. Restoring the temple in Jerusalem is an enormous and complicated undertaking, especially with regard to the many components and requirements set down by biblical and Jewish law. First, the temple must stand on its original biblical location. Popular belief is that the Muslim Dome of the Rock stands above the Holy of Holies of the temple. But some leading scholars, the best known of whom is Asher Kaufman, dispute this. He believes that the Even Hashtira, foundation stone, on which the Holy of Holies first stood, is 100 meters north of the Dome of the Rock, placing it directly under the small Dome of the Spirit, or Dome of the Tablets. A sign backs up this theory. A straight line runs from this small dome through the Golden Gate to the top of the Mount of Olives, where the red heifer used to be slaughtered and burnt to ashes. This was then brought on a ceremonial viaduct across the Kidron Valley into the temple, where it was mixed with water and used for sprinkling for the purification of sins. It was from this place, where the red heifer was slaughtered, that Jesus ascended into heaven. According to Jewish laws based on the construction of the first temple, the stones of the temple may not come into contact with iron. Between 1989 and 1991, 3 4-ton cornerstones were carved out using iron-free tools and a pebble mixture. They are prototypes for the third temple. Thirdly, a Jerusalem yeshiva or seminary is already preparing for the building of the third temple. Called Ateret Kohanim, Crown of Priests, it has been training suitable candidates to serve as temple priests. 4. In 1988, Rabbi Ariel Israel established the Temple Institute in Jerusalem to create the special articles and garments required for temple worship and rituals. Of the 104 required articles, 2/3 have already been made. Many of them are made of gold and precious stones, as described in Scripture. But the big question is, why Jerusalem? Jerusalem, largely neglected for hundreds of years, plays a central role in Jewish culture, history, and religion. Since 1004, before the Christian era, when King David established Jerusalem as the capital of the Jewish nation, there has remained a constant and enduring Jewish presence in the city. Moreover, Jewish liturgy, music, literature, and poetry all have references to Jerusalem or Zion, the biblical name of the city. Holy city to three major religions, Jerusalem is home to a unique concentration of religious sites. Since the city was reunified under Israeli sovereignty in 1967, the State of Israel has succeeded in protecting the rights of all religious groups to enjoy freedom of worship, and has restored and rebuilt Christian, Muslim, and Jewish holy places. At no other time in history have worshippers of all faiths enjoyed such a degree of religious freedom. 1. Jerusalem has been at the center of Jewish consciousness for over 3,000 years, even before King David made it the capital of his kingdom in 1005 before Christ. No other city has played such a predominant role in the history, culture, and religion of a people as has Jerusalem for the Jews. Jerusalem, or Zion, is mentioned over 800 times in the Jewish Bible. Throughout the diaspora, Jerusalem has always remained foremost in the thoughts of the Jewish people as they turn to Zion 3 times a day in prayer. Such everyday rituals as grace after meals or special ceremonies such as wedding blessings are replete with references to the Jewish people's yearning for their ancient capital. On holidays and festivals, Jews the world over bid one another the traditional farewell, next year in Jerusalem. Jewish independence in the land of Israel, which ended in 70 AD and was renewed in 1948, marks the longest period of sovereignty over Jerusalem by any nation. No other nation can claim such a long political existence in the recorded history of this unique city. Throughout all the 2,000 years of foreign rule over Jerusalem, Jews were persecuted, massacred, and subject to exile. In spite of this, the Jewish presence in Jerusalem remained constant and enduring. Jews have always chosen to settle in Jerusalem. Since 1840, the Jews have constituted the largest ethnic group in the city, and they have held an uninterrupted majority in Jerusalem since the 1860s. 2. The Jewish claim to Jerusalem as their capital is unique. Firstly, there's always been a national consensus in Israel on the status of Jerusalem. Since the reunification of the city in 1967, all Israeli governments have declared that united Jerusalem, Israel's eternal capital, is one indivisible city under Israeli sovereignty, and that free access to holy places will be guaranteed to members of all faiths. Secondly, only twice has Jerusalem served as a national capital. The capital of the biblical kingdoms of Israel and Judea before the Roman destruction of 70 AD, and the capital of the modern state of Israel since the rebirth of the Jewish state in 1948. Third, Beside the Jewish people, no other nation or state which gained political sovereignty over the area had ever made Jerusalem a capital city. Both the Arab and Mamluk empires ruled from Damascus, the Ottoman from Constantinople. None of these empires even granted Jerusalem the status of district capital. The third point is that historically Jerusalem is a united city. The 19-year occupation of eastern Jerusalem from 1948 to 67 is the only time in history that the city was divided, the result of unprovoked attack and unrecognized annexation. On May the 14th, 1948, Israel proclaimed its independence. Immediately, the surrounding Arab countries attacked the new state. The Arab Legion overran the Jewish quarter in East Jerusalem, while Israel held the Jewish-populated West. Jerusalem was now divided for the first time in its history. 2 years later, in 1950, Transjordan annexed the West Bank and Jerusalem, which was neither recognized by the world community nor even by the other Arab states. On the 5th of June 1967, an unprovoked Arab attack was launched on the Jewish-populated western neighborhoods of Jerusalem. The Israeli Defense Forces repelled the invasion, and on the 7th of June, they retook the old city, reuniting Jerusalem.
What actually happened in 1967 was that the war was with Egypt, with Jordan, and with Syria, so that whatever territories Israel ended up occupying that it had not occupied before 67 had been taken from the Egyptians, from the Jordanians, and from the Syrians. If we're speaking of the West Bank, or what we call Judea and Samaria, and certainly East Jerusalem, then it was taken from the Jordanians, not from the Palestinians, because the Palestinians had never had sovereignty in this area. In fact, the idea was that negotiations should be with the Jordanians, but it was only after 1974, after the Rabat Arab Summit Conference, that in fact the Arab states decided that negotiations about Palestine, or what we call Eretz Israel, should be only with the Palestinians, with the PLO. That means that was that was determined by the Arabs in 1974. But we had not taken it. We had not taken these territories from the Palestinians because they were not ruling this territory.
And the question of annexation.
Well, in fact, what happened right after the Six-Day War is that Israel annexed East Jerusalem. The rest of the territories were not annexed, and therefore their legal status is complicated, to say the least, because it is not clear, because there was not a state of Palestine from which we had taken these territories, but as I said, from Egypt, from Jordan, and from Syria. And therefore the question is who exactly the territories should be returned to, if they are to be returned, is, from a legal point of view, is a complicated question.
Jerusalem has always been undivided except for this 19-year period. There is no justification for this short period to be viewed as a factor in determining the future of the city and to negate 3,000 years of unity. There is no basis in international law to support a status of separate entity for the city of Jerusalem. This was a proposal contained in the 1947 UN Resolution 181, which never materialized, becoming irrelevant when the Arab states rejected it and invaded the State of Israel. Immediately following Israel's unification of Jerusalem in 1967, Jerusalem's Arab residents were offered full Israeli citizenship, though most declined to accept it. Nevertheless, they retained the right, as residents of the city, to participate in municipal elections and enjoy all benefits according to Israeli citizens.
That only few are really interested in dividing city again. Certainly not the Jews, and certainly not every people who understand that an organism like an urban organism should not be divided. So it was an unnatural situation in the years 48 until 67. Now, the Palestinians, by building their parliament at that time in Abu Dis, actually admitted that the capital of theirs, aspiring a capital, would never be Jerusalem. It would be Abu Dis, which doesn't belong to Jerusalem. It is outside the municipal borders, and it is outside the so-called security fence, which is now just being established. Now, I do believe that the Palestinians who are the residents of Jerusalem will have to make up their mind, and they will do that, because up till now they shun every decision where their future lies. Therefore, they boycotted, for instance, the elections to the municipality since '67, and by doing that they harmed themselves more than anyone else, because they excluded themselves out of the decision making of the municipal governance by allocating budgets, for instance. So you cannot claim, I don't get budgets enough for my own purposes, for my own interests, but actually you don't have anyone in the municipal council who is speaking for you, because you are not voting and you're not getting elected. Now, they were actually put under pressure by the Palestinians, who, although they are not in Jerusalem, they are ruling in Ramallah, would like to have a say. If you ask me what the future will bring, I think there will be a diminishing presence of the Palestinian polity in Jerusalem, and the Palestinian residents of Jerusalem will have to ask themselves, did we really do the right thing by boycotting the participation, our political participation in Jerusalem itself? What is shown just now is that just before the fence is erected completely, many Palestinians are re-immigrating Jerusalem legally and illegally, which means they have for themselves, each one for himself, good reason to be in Jerusalem resident, although he might be very upset about what he would call Israeli occupation. There are some benefits, certainly financial and economic benefits, which show him it's better to remain in Israel, in Jerusalem, within the fence, than outside the fence, and to share a future which is maybe not very known and unsecure with the Palestinian Authority. So this is the only explanation I have why so many tens of thousands Palestinians are pouring into the city now, are raising the rent of the flats immensely, because there is a demand.
The Israeli consensus on Jerusalem, it's culturally diverse, but politically united. The status of Jerusalem as the permanent capital of the State of Israel has been reiterated by all Israeli governments since the establishment of the state in 1948. In 1949, Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, acted to reconstitute Israel's parliament, the Knesset, in Jerusalem. In 1980, the Knesset legislated the Basic Law, which restates the position that Jerusalem, complete and united, is the capital of Israel. The status of Jerusalem is unique. Politically and spiritually, Jerusalem was, is, and always will be the capital of the Jewish people. Yet at the same time, as it plays a significant role in the religious identity of hundreds of millions of believers in the monotheistic faiths, the Arab world views Jerusalem as one, albeit not the most significant, of their holy places.
Will be the mayor of this city, Jerusalem. It's not easy task, but it's big challenge. Our population, they are with various people from Christian, Muslims, and Jewish people, and they live here side by side.
Throughout history, Jerusalem has been fought over by many nations. Today, people from more than 100 different nations live here. The Palestinian people never claimed Jerusalem as their capital. Only the militants, only as a political weapon, are claimed to statehood. If they're not Muslim, their interest is only in a homeland, not a capital city. If they are Muslim, it is religion, not politics. And throughout history, when the Muslims were in control of the city, they never made Jerusalem their capital. For the Muslims, Jerusalem is only the third most holy place. The first, for them, is Mecca. But for the Jewish people, they only have one holy city, only one place to fulfill their worship, their culture, and their identity. Without Jerusalem, there is no temple, there is no Messiah. The Christians know what the Bible says, that those who would worship God must worship Him in spirit. The Bible said God does not live in temples made with our hands, and every Christian believer should be the temple of the Holy Ghost. God lives not in Jerusalem, but in us. All three monotheistic faiths believe that the Messiah will come to Jerusalem. Also, they believe that the Jews will be in Jerusalem when that happens. But in the end, only the Messiah, when He comes, will bring peace to this city. Until then, Jerusalem will be like a stumbling block, like a stone. And the Bible says all nations will one day fight against Jerusalem at the Battle of Armageddon. Who will accept this challenge to live here in such a city? Only the Jewish people have the faith and the courage. And they have demonstrated it through blood, through toil, and through tears.